Hey everyone, I wanted to go over the rhetorical situations that our textbook deals with, and kind of give them to you in a little bit more of a coherent and clear language. So the first one I want to start with is purpose. A rhetorical situation is a fancy way of describing the goals of a particular communication. This description is kept pretty vague in part because rhetoric hopes to deal with all forms of communication, both written and otherwise. So the goal here is to make it that they can talk about all forms of language, all forms of both written texts, verbal texts, talking about the rhetoric of movies. They keep it broad so that they can bring in multiple forms and talk about the differences between these things. For our purposes, the main thing we need to think about is that all communication has a goal or purpose. Asking someone to get coffee hopes to maintain or create a friendship. Writing an essay aims to prove an understanding of concepts. Similarly, you have lab reports are there to contain and organize knowledge in a specific field of study. All of these are going to have different modes of communication. They're going to have different kind of different norms that keep them going. So we bring up the idea of purpose here first because everything that follows are ways of thinking about how you can achieve your purpose in your writing. So stance. This is going to be something that is both intuitive and somewhat slippery. Stance, according to the text, is an attitude toward your topic. As you picked a subject you already have an interest in, you also already have a stance. You feel certain ways about your subject. You have information already that allows you to form opinions, and so because of this, you can read one text and say it's reliable. You can read another text and say it's not. The reason this gets slippery is when you start bringing it back into this idea of purpose. If you come on too strong, some readers will likely be alienated. This is more true the more controversial your subject is. Because of that, you'll always want to be thinking about towing this line and thinking about how much you should let your stance be known. If it's a group of friends, obviously you can be a little bit more bold in your claims. Whereas if you have if you are publishing this and it's going to a wide, unknowable audience, you obviously want to kind of pull back and let the stance be a little bit more, not unclear, but a little bit more managed. Next is genre. In our context, this is easy. Genre asks what kind of writing you will be engaged in. Often we think about genre in terms of fiction or poetry or science fiction or what kind of movies do you like? Comedies, action, horror, whatever these groupings that we have. In our context here, genre is going to be far broader. Emails, texts, lab reports, literary essays. These are all examples of genre because they are all forms of writing that have different norms attached to them. Each will have its own specific conventions in order to serve your purpose. So, for example, you don't use emojis in a formal essay or memo, whereas in an email to a close friend or text, these are going to be very normed and very easy to do. Genre can get a lot more specific. For example, this essay that we're going to be working on is an evaluative essay, rather than our module 1 was a summary response essay. I'm going to get a little bit more into that in the last slide. But for the most part, there's going to be big shared traits. Thesis statement, evidence attached to claims, topic sentences, these kind of broader ideas of conventions for essay writing. These are all going to be shared because this is still an essay, but the specifics are going to be somewhat altered. Sorry about that. So now we're thinking about the most important thing here. Is we're going to be looking at audience. This is the most important concept Because if every communication has a goal, then who you are trying to accomplish that goal with is the most important consideration. If you are, again, the example I always go to, if you're trying to borrow money from your roommate, you are going to have a very different approach than if you're going to try and get me to give you an extension on an assignment. So you're always thinking about playing your audience. We do this so intuitively, except when we get into writing. It feels like we sometimes lose that we have a particular audience that we are trying to reach. So like I've mentioned before in the previous slide, if your stance is shared by your audience, you can be explicit. You can you can paint in broad strokes because you know everyone is going to agree with you. Alternatively, if you know it's a hard sell or a controversial issue, you might need to pull back on the aggressiveness of your claim, perhaps throwing in evidence beforehand to kind of set yourself up. These are ways that we think about audience in terms of essay writing through our stance. Similarly with genre, if you turn in a Dear Mr. Davidson email to the essay, this is not going to give you a good grade. It's because you have an example of the genre being mixed up. So you're always thinking about how these things will affect your audience. These are big glaring mistakes, but for what you can think about them more is how do you start thinking about them in terms of how they relate to the essay you've read. Who is their audience? And we're going to get into that a little bit more. Like this idea of, are there moments, like one of the ways that you can look at these is to ask, what knowledge does the essay expect you to know? Does it assume you have a context for something? So the things that it explains versus the things that it doesn't explain can often be very key in kind of giving a sense of who they want to read, who their ideal audience is. So tying all of this to an evaluative essay is you're writing to look at these components and see whether it was done well or not. So that question just brought up of like, do they have like this idea of like, who is the audience that they're trying to reach? Are there moments where that gets confused, where it seems to kind of like pick a fight with the people that it's trying to convince? Are there moments where you see like tension or antagonism between the audience and the essayist? Like, or even more like, clearly, is there moments that it neglects certain like wide-ranging audiences because it assumes people have knowledge? These can be ways that an essay fails to do things well. On the other hand, what I want to emphasize in the second bit is we often think of evaluation in a way that is entirely negative. It isn't just a drawing attention to the mistakes. It can also be highlighting the ways that a text is successful at accomplishing its goals. So what I want you to think about as you're writing your essay is also looking at the ways that like this essay is a success in that it does have a really like tight sense on who its audience is. It's coherent. It's like clear what they want to communicate, what their goals are. Is the stance done in a way that isn't like overpowering? These are all things that will be evaluated as like, yes, this essay is doing a very good job. A good rule of thumb to think about is that arguments that do both and rather than either or are more complicated and more sophisticated. You don't want to just say this essay is bad. What is far more complicated and nuanced is going to be an essay that says, hey, you know, this essay is really convincing. They have really good, say, like statistics behind them. They have really good research, but it seems like sometimes they don't know who they're talking to. It seems like the idea of audience might be a little bit muddled or confusing. This allows you to kind of give an argument that is more particular, which then will help you be more specific in your own argument. Hope everything makes sense. Hope your writing is going well. And I'm excited to see the rough drafts that you turn in for me on Thursday. Have a good night.